And some things you just don't know, right? Some things you just don't know, but we know enough. And I think all of us at this point know enough. And so those of us, who have the microphones or who have opportunities and can be a voice for the animals, we got to do it.
As a vegan, do you ever feel like you're living in a parallel universe, aware of things that many others don't even seem to notice, let alone acknowledge? I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. We talk with vegans from around the globe who, like you, are living lives of integrity and compassion with an eye toward justice. Through their personal stories, you'll come to see that you're not an outlier. In fact, you're part of an entire posse of individuals who aren't just keeping the peace, they're creating it through their food choices and beyond. You won't be saddling up, but you're in for the ride of your life. Welcome to the Vegan Posse. Hey Posse, I'm your host, Chrissy Benson. A long time ago when I was feeling lost and lonely after just having moved to New York City, I went to an animal rights event led by vegan activist Mickey Z. He was encouraging people to get involved in the animal rights movement. And one of the positives he mentioned was that you end up making great friends. Now, that possibility was something that had honestly never occurred to me before. Animal rights was a cause I felt morally compelled to participate in, but it never crossed my mind that it might also be a way to connect with other humans. That was over a decade ago. But since then, one of the aspects of veganism that I've most come to appreciate is that it ups the caliber of the individuals I associate with, both past and present. I feel historically connected to people like Leonardo da Vinci, Walt Whitman, and Gandhi. And in the present day, there's really nothing like connecting with people who aren't ignoring the parallel universe of animal suffering. This week, I got to chat with one such person, Karen Kenney, who's from my former home of Massachusetts. Karen now lives in New Hampshire, and she's been vegan for 23 years. She's a certified spiritual mentor, writer, podcast host, and life coach. And you'll see why she's known for her storytelling, her sense of humor, her Boston accent, and her down-to-earth, no BS approach to spirituality, self-development, and transformational work. She's been a yoga teacher for 25 years, and she's also an author, speaker, and host of the Karen Kenney Show podcast. So enjoy this conversation with Karen Kenney. Karen, welcome to the Vegan Posse. Are you ready for the ride of your life?
I am ready. I feel like I've already been on the ride of my life being vegan for this long, but yeah.
Right, exactly. I bet you're wicked ready, in fact.
I am wicked ready, actually, yes.
So it's so interesting. We had a mutual colleague, Valerie Martin, to thank for connecting us. And I'm so happy that she did, because since then I've been amazed at how many overlaps we've got.
I know. You said we have the Boston connection, and then you were just up here visiting your brother, I think you said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, and you wrote your novel is based in Boston as well.
My novel is based in Boston. And not only that, my novel is called Marrying Myself. And I discovered that another amazing coincidence is you have a bunch of things in common with my protagonist, Julia Jones. So in the book, she's a vegan, of course. She, like you, was raised Catholic, as was I. Both you and Julia went to Boston University. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then this is another just very funny coincidence. Well, a sad coincidence, but in my novel, Julia lost her mother at a young age when she was only 11. And I discovered that you yourself had a loss. You lost your own mother when you were 12, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm definitely, your book is, I'm going to read your book. P.S. by the way, I'm also a writer. I'm writing a memoir. So, writers supporting writers, I think artists, we have to support one another, but I can't wait to check out your book. But I didn't realize, I mean, I knew your book was set in Boston, your protagonist was there, but I did not know that she went to BU. She had an early loss. So that's just fascinating. This is how I know, like, when paths are supposed to cross, like here we are, you know?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I didn't know all those things either. I knew there were some things in common, like the ones that you mentioned, but when I discovered all those things you had in common with my protagonist, who of course is part of me, I was really
Of
amazed.
course.
It made me feel like I was subconsciously channeling you, even though I don't think we've ever met. I don't think we crossed
I
paths when I
don't
was in
think
Boston.
so, but I just want to say, yeah, I want to say thank you to Val too for making the connection, and it's so
Yes.
nice when somebody recognizes something in two people, and then they make the connection, and then I think magic can happen. So I'm really excited to be here, and I love that you do a show that gives voice to yes, the vegans, but like why we're vegan. So it gives the animals a voice, which is one of the main things that my mother taught me in the short years I had with her, is that you got to give a voice for the voiceless. And she was an advocate for, I mean, it wasn't her full-time job, but she was a volunteer at Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Prevention for like cruelty to children, and so she advocated,
Mm.
for kids. But my mother like took in every stray that there was, animal or human, like that was just her nature, and it certainly rubbed off on me as well. So I just love that you do this podcast and you talk about things that really matter. Especially, I think vegans are really misunderstood. So I think it's great that you have a platform where you talk to lots of different vegans and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I'm curious to hear a lot more about that. You, of course, have your own podcast, The Karen Kenney Show.
mm,
So
yes.
I mean, you help people understand vegans. Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about why you think we're misunderstood. I don't disagree, but I'm curious to hear more about that. But before we
Yeah, I
do,
mean, how much time? Go
I
ahead.
know, right?
I know.
But just going back to the early days in Boston. So, what was it like for you growing up? I mean, how did you grow up eating, and did you ever think about the animals in our food system at the time?
No, I mean, I think I just kind of came through an animal lover. I always loved animals. And I literally as a little kid, like little, I wanted, besides loving books and words and reading, I loved animals, like loved animals. And I wanted to be Dr. Doolittle. Like I just thought being able to talk to animals would have been like the coolest thing ever. And I
Mm,
wanted to be Dr. Doolittle, which kind of rolled into, like many young girls, I wanted to be a veterinarian, and I thought, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to help animals. And because my mother also loved animals, um, we always had, like, I have this one picture of her and she's like leaning over a tank of, back then we had those little glass tanks and there's some gerbils inside. And there's a cat sitting next to her, like looking at the gerbils. And there's a dog with his paws like up on the table. And it's like, so there are always animals in our lives. And I also, our stepfather, though, he was a hunter. So it was a very conflicting thing. Like he would
mm,
take us deep sea fishing, like when we were kids. And, they were always like throwing chum in the water. And you start to realize, like, oh, chum, like that's just another word for like dead, chopped up fish. And that's one of the things we do in our society is we mislabel things to misdirect what's really happening, right? We call it bacon instead of dead pig. We call it burgers instead of poor murdered cow, right? So at a young age, it was like conflicting messages because he would hunt and then he would come home and there'd be like a deer hanging in the garage, and it was just like horrifying. But he was a wicked tough guy, and you weren't allowed to show weakness, and so you just kind of had to, I always say, suck it up and stuff it down and pretend like it didn't bother you. And he had like deer hooves holding his guns, and then there was like a deer head and it was named Harry or something, and everybody just kind of like it was just these conflicting messages. I think, oh, we love these animals and then we eat these animals. And I can tell you more about my stepfather, but I always say I'm saving it for the book. But so I wanted to be a veterinarian. And my mother always, my mother, I was a wicked, wicked, wicked sensitive kid. And my mother was the one who like truly, truly saw me. And I think she saw that sensitivity in me and she wanted to protect it. And, she was murdered when I was 12 years old. And, after that, my whole life just like blew apart. It was never the same. And once she was out of my life, everything, like I said, everything just kind of like fell apart. And so my biggest cheerleader was now missing from my life, but I still had this belief because she used to tell me, if you want to be a veterinarian, you can do anything you want to do, type of a thing. So my freshman year at BU, I go to BU, and when I come home, because that was the thing. So after my mother was killed, my biological father didn't take us. My stepfather didn't want us. So we ended up going to live with an aunt and uncle who I didn't know. So I lived with them from the time I was like 12 and a half till I was 17. So about 4.5 years. And so once I graduated, so like, how do I say this? So once I graduated high school and went into college at 17 at BU, it was like they took my old room, which my sister and I shared at one point, but my sister's a year and a half older than me. So she left home, and then I was still with them for another year. So once I left their house, their kids who were younger than us, right, were like, I think when I left, they were probably, because when we moved in, I was 12, Christine was like 2. So their kids were like 10 and 7 years younger than us. So when we finally left, they turned our rooms into their kids' rooms. So I had no place to go. So like I'm 17 at college, but when it's school break or Easter or Christmas or whatever, I had nowhere to go.
You had no
So I
home.
ended up kind of
Yeah.
like popping around and stuff like that. But one of those summers, I came home, and in Methuen, there was a guy who had a famous kennel called TM Kennels. And he also not only had a kennel, but he raised and trained and breeded and like all this stuff, German shepherds. And so I spent the summer working there. And one of the things that happened that I discovered about myself is I got way too attached to the animals and to the dogs. And I started to kind of see the underbelly, besides my mother being murdered and growing up with a stepfather who was just brutal. I started to see the underbelly of human behavior, and how people would often like bring their dogs like to the kennel and then never come back. And whether it's because they were old and they were sick or they were going to die, like they would just abandon their animals. And there were times when an animal that I had fallen in love with, like, would die in my arms, and I would just be bereft. And I was like, like, I don't know if I can swear on the show, but I was like these people, like, how can people do this? And I started to realize, like, I started making the connection of like what really goes into being a veterinarian. And I was like, yeah, I don't know if I can actually deal with the human part of it. Like I would want to save the animals. And
Right.
honestly, I don't
Right.
know if my science skills would, I know it's an intense like thing to become a veterinarian. And
Right.
veterinarians, interestingly, have a really high suicide rate, which I think is fascinating. And I am
Oh, I
sure
didn't
it is
know
tied
that.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, so much of what they have to do. So anyway, so growing up, yeah, we ate meat. Um, we ate meat. It wasn't never really like talked about. We were poor, so a lot of our food, like, my stepfather was a Wonder Bread man. So I literally didn't have a piece of whole grain bread until I was like in my 30s, I jokingly say. We grew up on canned food, and we grew up on like fast food. My mother didn't, she cooked, but not that, it was like whatever. So
Hmm.
my relationship with all of that was, it wasn't like veganism. I didn't even know, but I had heard of like being a vegetarian, but I don't think it was
Yeah.
until I went to Boston University and then I'm in the cafeteria and it's like, oh, there's like vegetarian options. Like, what's that? Do you know what I
Oh,
mean?
they were labeled like in the dining hall?
Well, in the dining hall, you would have like non-meat options, right? There'd be like
Yeah. Yeah.
something else. And yeah. And so I had developed a really interesting relationship with food because when I was 15, because my family never talked about my mother. Like it was literally like she was there one day, gone the next. And even though her murder was all over the news and everything like that, everybody would just like take the paper away, shut it off. Like you couldn't, on the radio, they'd shut it off. So it was literally like she disappeared overnight. Nobody ever talked about it. Back then there wasn't like therapy for that. Nobody was coming to check on you. We didn't talk about our feelings. And so I just kind of dumped everything inside,
What
sucked it up
about
and
your
stuffed it down. And
siblings?
so I,
Did you talk to your siblings about it, or everybody just kind of shut
well,
down?
no, yeah, I had my biological sister, but we were just like in survival mode.
I
And
bet.
it wasn't that kind of relationship where it was one of these things like, there's a thing in Massachusetts, kids, we call them massholes, right? So there's a thing with massholes where it's like, I can pick on you. I can pick on you and be brutal to you, but nobody else is going to do it type of a thing. You know what I mean? So we were
Mm.
sisters and she wasn't going to leave me behind or anything, but it was not nurturing. It was like, even when we had to like pick where we were going to go live because our biological father had already like moved to Illinois and he was with a woman with like 8 kids. Like that was like he couldn't care for himself. Never mind us. My stepfather outright didn't want us. So it was like, well, you can go live with this aunt and uncle or this aunt and uncle. And either one was just like, and I just kept saying like, I want to go live with dad, meaning my stepfather. And my sister was like, well, tough shit. That's not an option. So deal with it. So that was kind of the attitude growing up. There was no warm fuzzies and let's talk about things. You know what I mean? So no, we didn't ever talk about it. And so I just kind of, stuffed everything inside and I started to develop irritable bowel syndrome at 15. And I had my first attack, my IBS attack at like Cannibal Lake Park. And it was just hell. So for me, like eating ended up becoming also like it would cause
Mm.
me pain. It was not a soothing thing. But like fast forward to all of this, I go to BU and to tell you like how the whole vegan thing happened. Still always loved animals. And I moved out to Los Angeles after I graduated from Boston University. And at some point in my journey out there, one of my spiritual mentors and like my spiritual godmother and my dear friend Marianne Williamson, who's also a writer, she introduced me to another person that she knew who was a musician. And she said, and he had lost his sweetheart, his girlfriend, to murder as well. And so
Oh.
Marianne thought like, oh, I think you two will be a great pairing. And so he and I dated for a while, and his name was Bobby Rock. And Bobby was vegan. So I went out on tour with them for a little while. And I'll never forget this. I will never forget this for the rest of my life until the day I die. So we're at a restaurant. I recognize that I know that he's vegan, but I still don't know exactly what that means. I just know he doesn't eat animals. That's how I'm thinking of it at the time back in the day. So this is like 1996, 1997. And, and we were at a restaurant with the rest of the band and the crew. And I wanted to be respectful. And just even knowing he was vegan, it started to plant some seeds in my head. Like, yeah, like why do I eat animals? But you know how like you got those blocks up in your head because you're so deeply conditioned. So I batted with myself like, okay, I'll just get a pizza, right? I'll just eat cheese or whatever because I didn't want to eat a dead animal in front of him. And I'll never forget offering him a bite of my pizza because I still didn't get it. And he just looked at me and he was like, ew. He's like, gross. And I was so taken aback because I was like, wait, what's gross about this? Like I didn't get it. And he's like, yeah, if you want some blood and pus in your food or something. And I was like, wait, what? So I was so conditioned by the world at that point. I'd questioned a lot of things, but the one thing I didn't question is the food system and like the whole thing. And so I started to do some research and I started to realize that like I literally, this is how ignorant I was. And I think, I don't think some people listening might be surprised to hear this, right? But I didn't know that dairy cows, like I just thought, oh, dairy cows produce dairy. I didn't understand that they are just lactating like how women do, that they had to be pregnant. And then I thought,
Yeah,
well,
it's
how do they
breast
get them
milk. Yeah,
pregnant? Right.
same here. I didn't realize,
Right.
I didn't really, really fully realize that until after I went vegan, honestly. A little before I went
Yeah.
vegan. But yeah, and it seems so obvious. It's ridiculous. But yeah, same here. So I don't think you were alone
But
in
they
that.
don't, yeah, but they don't. And I feel like, the systems in place don't really want you to think about it too much. And then you
Definitely.
start to
Yeah.
realize, yeah, it's all a racket. It's all a racket. So you start to realize like, okay, so these poor animals are raped, and then people will always correct me and they'll say, do you mean artificially inseminated? I'm like, let's call it what it is. If
Well,
somebody
they
put
use the
their body part,
term. They call it a rape rack in the industry.
it's like, right.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's not just
So,
us.
yeah.
The
So,
industry
right.
itself uses the term. Yeah.
It's so horrifying, and then you realize what happens to those cows and their infected udders and what's allowed in milk, and then you understand that what happens to those baby cows who are male and end up as veal, and how horrifying their short young lives are, being chained and not being able to stand because the humans want the meat nice and tender. Like all of it just makes it just like it's so horrifying and so heartbreaking, and you start to realize like, oh, this cheese is not so harmless. And then you start to branch out, and then you start to go like, oh, well, then these eggs aren't that harmless. So I slowly started to we talk about it like, oh, I'm like, I started to unlearn a lot of bullshit that was like fed to us, right? So I started to unlearn, learn, and then relearn some things. And it was Bobby Rock that really, and he never did it. Like he was just the living, breathing example. He never crammed it down your throat. He was never like, he was just living his life and being who he was. And
But
it
he told it
really
like it
stuck with me.
was. He'd call
If
it
you had a
out as blood
question,
and pus. Yeah.
yeah, he would just like say it like it was. And so I was like, okay.
Is he still
So
vegan, by the
around
way? Do you happen to know if
oh
he's
yeah,
Yeah,
hardcore,
okay.
hardcore. He actually started his own. He started his own protein line. Like he's done everything. So he's a famous musician. He tours still the world with Lita Ford, and he lives in L.A. and he's the quintessential musician. But he's been sober and vegan for like 30, 40, I don't even know, a wicked long time. So it's pretty incredible, and he's still going strong to this day. And then around that same time, I started doing research on my mother for my book and her murder. Because remember, back then, nobody would let us see anything. And one of the things that always haunted me, and this is part of the vegan story, one of the things that always haunted me is I wanted to know, like, I wanted to know if she suffered, because I had heard little snippets like over time, like because there was a trial and the guy who killed her got caught and blah blah blah, and I would hear snippets once in a while. And one day I got home before my aunt and uncle, and I grabbed the paper off the porch and I started to read what was going on with the trial. And as soon as my aunt saw it, she grabbed it, but like a couple of things got through and got in my head. But I just remember wondering, like, did she suffer? I mean, she was beaten to death. He punched and kicked her to death, and it was awful. And when I started to do the research, like I wrote to the Lawrence Eagle Tribune and I said, I identified myself. This is who I am. I'm looking for these. And they were so kind. And somebody went back in the archives, because this was 1981. Like they didn't have computers and stuff like that. So they photocopied all of the newspaper articles that they could find on her story. And I'll never forget that, getting that envelope in the mail. I lived in Burbank at the time, and I got that envelope, and my hands were just shaking, and I was like, oh my God. And it took me like a half an hour or so, an hour to like open it and like look at it. But there was one article where they had talked to the medical examiner or whatever. And the thing that it said that just like broke my heart, like just ruined me. And it said, she had cuts on her hands and her knees from trying to get away. She was trying to crawl away from her killer. And still to this day. And it just ruined me. And I just thought, she wanted to live, and she was fighting to live. And then somehow the dots in my head got connected that animals just want to live. And how can you be the child? First of all, how can you be an animal lover and keep eating them? How can you be the child of a mother who was violently murdered and participate in the suffering of other beings? And so slowly, I always say gradually, but inevitably, all these little lights were like lighting up, right, in my subconscious and in my mind. And then I was like, I do not want to participate in the suffering of any animals. But then you're not aware yet, like, you don't quite know like the underbelly of it all. So I just kept going, and I stopped eating meat. It's kind of this thing, like you stop eating meat, you stop eating eggs, and then cheese is like the great, like hypnotic, seductive. It's like one of the hottest things for people to give up. And so that was the last thing I gave up, was cheese. And then I became a yoga teacher. And the whole foundation of yoga, the very first foundation, is ahimsa, which is nonviolence and non-harm and compassion in thought, words, and deeds, and towards all creatures. And I started thinking to myself, how could I be like a yoga teacher and still participate like in this racket. And so I just made the hardcore decision. And also for, it's funny. I have a friend, Norma. She's famous. She had like one of the only vegan restaurants in New Hampshire. It was called Susty's. It's not open anymore, but
Mm.
it was in Northwood. And I just happened when I left California, I moved to Northwood. So there was a vegan restaurant like right down the street from my house.
Ah,
And I went
perfect.
and worked with her. Yeah, and I worked there, and she made the most delicious food. Like she taught me how to make like seitan from scratch, and how to make tofu focaccias and tofu egg salad, and like I learned how to make gravies and like all this stuff. And she was such a fantastic teacher. She was another vegan in my life who made a huge difference. And but one day she said to me, we were talking about vegans, and I said, yeah, I go, it's so strange to me when I hear quote unquote certain vegans saying that they don't really care about the animals, that they're just doing it for their own health. And she said, oh yeah. And she was funny. She would smoke, and she had a really raspy voice. She was a hot shit. And she was like, oh yeah, those are the megans. She goes, those are the megans. They only care about themselves. So that term has always stuck with me. I just think it's so
That's
funny.
good. That's good.
She's
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. She's like the Megans. So it was like this whole thing of like overcoming trauma, my IBS, the animals, the education, and like all signs were just pointing to no. And then I think it was in 2000, Tribe of Hot. Tribe of Hot is this woman, Jenny Klein, and another guy, and they started
Yeah.
producing these movies. And there was a movie called The Witness.
Yes.
And The
Yes. I've
Witness
seen
came
it.
out in
Yep.
2000. Yeah, The Witness came out in 2000. And it was like a punch in the face because this guy, Eddie Lama, who was like a construction worker, hardcore New
Hmm.
Yorker guy.
Hmm.
But he had this kitten that he rescued, and he fell in love with this kitten for the people who are listening. And he just made the connection one day, like, I would kill for this cat. Like nobody's gonna hurt this kitten. Why would I want to then eat a chicken or whatever? And it started to like, blow up for him. And I showed that movie. I showed that movie in my yoga studio. I used to do movie nights because I wanted to educate people.
Hmm.
And I'll never forget watching that and showing that. And just, I was sobbing. Like every time I saw the movie, and even many times I showed it, I would start sobbing. And I would also look around the room and realize like some people would be crying, but some people were just completely unaffected. And they had just accepted, like, this is just how it is. And then those are the people who say things like, I'm never going to give up my cheese. I'm never going to give up bacon. I'm never going to give up whatever. And I was like, you guys, being vegan is, and then they would say, oh, well, I'm vegan. And I'm like, no, what you're describing is plant-based, and there was all these labels that started to come out, and there was all this confusion. And so, I think I was disappointed that the movie didn't affect people as much as it affected
Yeah.
me. I would
Yeah.
get really frustrated because a lot of my yoga teacher friends, and even to this day, and people get pissed at me sometimes because I just am very direct, and I'm not mean, and I don't cram. I've been vegan for almost 23 years. I don't cram it down people's throat, but I'm not going to hide who I am either to make you more comfortable. I'm not going to say anything to you. I'm not going to get up in your face and judge you or whatever. But I just don't know how you can stand on the principles of ahimsa and then still keep chowing down on dead animals, like poor dead and murdered animals. Like I just don't get it. So I think there's a lot of incongruency in the world. I think a lot of, and I'm going to stop talking in case because I know I can talk a lot. So I'm going to pause in case you want to say something, and then I have more thoughts. But
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree, and I'm completely with you. I do think that we vegans it is this fine line between, yes, not judging other people, not walking around in judgment and anger, but at the same time, we're all the animals have. If we don't speak up, nobody will. And like you, it
mhm.
is fascinating and really, really just baffling how the same information can affect people differently. I think it was it Paul McCartney who said that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian. But I think that's not quite true because some people would just kind of look away and just or walk past really fast, and yeah, things just don't affect people in the same way. And I think also some people have a higher tolerance for not living in accordance with their moral values. They're just not as wired that way. I know for myself, I went vegan very reluctantly. In fact, I was vegetarian like you. I was vegetarian before going
Mm,
vegan. And when I started learning a little more about the egg industry and then later about the dairy
mm,
industry, I realized like I can't justify participating in that system. But I was reluctant to give up the foods, the so-called foods. But I just knew that niggling feeling was never going to go away. So finally, reluctantly, I went vegan. And then, of course, a whole new world opened up, and it was, the best decision I've ever made. And it's, fantastic. But in the moment, it was not something I did joyfully. But the last thing I wanted to mention that you touched on was just, the dairy industry. It's just so funny. I don't think it's an accident, of course, that most people aren't aware how it works. It's proactively hidden from us what happens to these animals.
absolutely.
But it's just fascinating to me. And I thought a lot more about this when I was in the process of writing my novel because my character had lost her mother. I was just really thinking a lot about how twisted it is and how strange it is that our society, and especially the Catholic Church, like you, I grew up Catholic and were raised with this reverence for motherhood. And that's the most sacred bond that there is, this mother-child bond, the Virgin
Hmm.
Mary, the Holy Mother. it's
Hmm.
it's sacrosanct, and yet we have a whole industry that's premised on the abomination of that bond. It's not just incidental, that it damages that mother-child connection. That's fundamental to it, and it's horrifying. And it's so weird. Yeah, the lengths that we humans will go to, and just, they're really, there's kind of no limit to the evil and the horrors. And I think there's also no limit to the good and the beauty too. It's just we occupy the spectrum. So tell me, after you went vegan, number one, how hard was it for you, and how did it affect your personal relationships?
Um, I think I'll never forget when I first told a few members of my family we were at a cookout, and they kept trying to convince me to have a burger because I used to pound McDonald's. Like I used to eat all that stuff, back in the day. And I was like, no, I'm not eating that. And they kept saying to me, but they're happy cows, like fucking, but they were happy cows. Like just imagine they were happy. And I was like, no, I'm not doing this. And one of the things that happens, I often talk about going vegan. Like I'm also a non-drinker. I'm not a non-drinker because I ever had a problem with alcohol. I just decided at one point I was like, I'm a yoga teacher. I'm a spiritual mentor. I'm trying to awaken to the truth of myself. Why am I putting stuff in my body that's like putting me to sleep and numbing me?
i'm
Like this
i'm
doesn't make
exactly
sense
the
anymore. And I was,
same. Yeah, I'm exactly
yeah,
the
I
same.
was,
I'm a
I was,
non-drinker, not because I'm alcoholic.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So funny.
exactly. So I was a bartender and I was a waitress. So like I'd been around the industry long enough. I was like, yeah, no. And just seeing what it did to people, even your favorite regulars. I'm feeding them poison. Like I'm like, why? Like I don't want to do this anymore, type of thing. So and the reason that why I'm bringing that up is that there's something that happens, I think, when you stop participating in a particular way or in a culture in a particular way, especially when everybody else around you continues that habit or that behavior, because for a lot of people, just your presence it's evocative, it evokes something in them, right? So I can't tell you when I stopped drinking, like again, just decided to not drink anymore. I used to smoke, I did it all, like I decided to stop smoking, whatever. The people who knew me would come up to me and say, like, kind of whisper and be like, yeah, I should probably stop drinking too. And I'm like, well, that's not why I did it, but I support you in that journey. Like, and I'm not judging you if you keep going, I'm just doing what's right for me. And I think vegans in particular make people really uncomfortable because it is so against the grain.
Mhm.
People think it's weird too when I did a whole podcast of this called Let's Talk About Drinking. People often say to me, like, are you a friend of Bill's? Like, are you in the program? And I'm like, they just can't wrap their head around that you would just choose to stop drinking alcohol. I'm like, it is so deeply ingrained in the subconscious and the culture of us, but so is eating animals. And when I decided to go vegan, and I often jokingly say to my sweetie is my husband. He's a professional musician. And when we first got together, he was thinking about already becoming vegetarian or, whatever. And so we were about to move in together. And I said to him, if we're going to live together, I said, you're going to have to you're going to have your own fridge. You're going to have to get your own pots and pans because I'm not cooking that stuff for you. I don't want to see it, blah, blah, blah. And so he literally went vegan on the spot. But what made it easy for him is that I had already gone first. So I knew how to cook good things. I knew how to make the transition a little bit easier, like whatever. But I jokingly say to him, because neither one of us drink and neither one of us, we're both vegans. I'm like, yeah, the non-drinking vegans don't get invited anywhere because we evoke, I think, for some people, just guilt, just by your nature of being, is that they feel bad about what they're doing. So when I go places, I just bring my own food. I have just gotten used to the fact that people make it way harder than it is to feed a vegan. I'm like, do you have some regular pasta? And they're always like, gluten free. I'm like, nope, I'm a glutton for gluten. I eat plenty of gluten. I just need some regular pasta, some marinara with no cheese in it, some bread and a salad. I'll bring my own dressing. Like, it's so easy. I'm like, we're not that hard to feed, but the way that, again, the culture wants you to not be outside of it. It wants you to keep participating. So I just think, like you said, like the whole dairy industry, like even like the old McDonald had a farm, and I'm like, yeah, let's talk about what happened on that farm. You know what I mean? Let's talk about what happened to those animals on the farm. So there is a brainwashing that happens. There is a conditioning that happens. And so one of my jobs is, I think is just like even right now, like I'm wearing my friend Jordan, his business is Conscious Muscle, right? And on the back it says, we kill workouts, not animals. And he's an incredible vegan bodybuilder and trainer. So like I kind of represent that way. Like I'll wear vegan shirts out in public. If people try to get sassy with me, like I said, I don't just go up to somebody and say anything. But if I'm teaching or I'm doing something and it's around Thanksgiving, I'll say, do you guys know how many turkeys are like murdered for? And I don't say killed. I say, do you know how many turkeys are like murdered for Thanksgiving? I'm like, 41 billion. I go, think about all those poor innocent birds. So like, I just seed drop like on people. Like I'll just drop a little thing. I educate. A lot of people who are trying to transition into vegan will reach out to me and stuff. So I do a lot of education. I've had Jordan on my show like 3 times, 4 times. I love to
I
talk
heard
about
one
it.
of your interviews. Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah,
And yeah, it was amazing hearing you
yeah,
chat with him.
he's something else. And excuse me. And I just feel like we do have to be the voice for the voiceless. And I do see it as like, I'm not here to make other people feel guilty, but I'm not going to shy away from the truth, and I'm not going to not say it. If it, like,
Mhm.
I will say, like, if somebody does a cheap shot to me, like, oh, you vegans, and I'll say, here's the thing. I go, you guys, this is where I say we're misunderstood. I'm like, you think that vegans think we're better than everybody else, but you got it backwards. We don't think we're better than anybody else, including animals. And that's why we're vegan. It's because we think all beings have a right to live. We don't think we're superior to you. And I know people who it is literally, because I'm also a hypnotist, right? So I'm a spiritual mentor, I'm a hypnotist, I'm a life coach and a change worker. So I'm fascinated by why people do what they do, think what they think, believe what they believe, say what they say. And you can literally see first of all, you can see like the cognitive dissonance happening when you're talking. You can see how they put things in little boxes. So because they don't want to give up their cheese, like they don't want to give up their ice cream, they don't want to give up that thing that they have a deeply ingrained emotional attachment to, sometimes familial through their family. This is what my nana always made or my grandmother always made. And people would say to me, so if you all my grandparents are dead, but they'll say, and my grandmother wasn't making me any food, but let's say she was. If I went there and they're like, and what if she made you like a thing? And I'm like, I wouldn't eat it. They're like, but it's your grandmother. I'm like, I'm not going to go against my values to make somebody else more comfortable. I don't care if it's the Pope. I always say, if Jesus Christ himself wanted to feed me fish, I would pass. Like, no, And you get all the ridiculousness. Don't you think carrots feel pain? What if you were on a deserted island and the only thing you can eat, like every stupid played out question
Hmm.
that, where do you get your protein? Like, I'm like, dude, do I look like I'm withering away after 23 years? I'm like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, I'm all set. Thank you for your rhetoric and your propaganda, right? And they think
Right.
we're the ones pushing propaganda. I'm like, oh my God, take a look around at how much these industries don't want you to know.
Right, right. And it's hilarious to me when they ask you these questions. They seem to think that they're the first person who's ever asked that question, is the first time we've ever heard it, you
How
know?
clever. How
Yeah,
clever.
so
How
clever.
clever.
Yeah, so clever. So
And
tell me
that's the
about
thing.
your
I'm like, oh, go ahead.
go
No, go
No,
ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, tell us more about your journey. So you went from, becoming a vegan yourself to obviously, shifting into not only just living this way yourself, but helping other people find a better way to live, both, physically and, spiritually and emotionally. What was your journey like?
I mean, to me, and I know you know this, right? Vegan is not a diet, it's a lifestyle. And so many opportunities come up throughout, like just me being out in the world. People like when I wear this shirt to the gym because Jordan has like 100, I don't know, he's got a gazillion followers. So when people would see me wearing this shirt, like a conversation, people would be like, "Oh, is that Conscious Muscle online?" I say, "Yep," and it would always start a conversation, right? If I'm in a checkout line and somebody will see what's in my food basket or whatever, they'll be like, "Oh, is that good?" Like there's all these organic, like I said, these organic opportunities for conversations. And so for me, like I have friends when they first meet me and they'll say, "Oh my God, look at these beautiful shoes," or "Look at what X, Y, and Z," or "We're going to SeaWorld," and I'll be like, "Fuck SeaWorld." And they'll be like, "Wait, what?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no SeaWorld, no zoos, no rodeos, no place where animals are having," and they look at you like you're from another planet because it's never, ever, ever occurred to them. And so I just like, one of my jobs as a spiritual mentor, I always say, it's not my job to tell people what to think, but what I love is inviting people to think, to critically think for themselves, to question everything, like
Mhm.
question. And I'll say to them, I'll say, "You're an animal lover, right?" And they'll say, "Yeah." I said, "And you have a dog or a cat or whatever the thing is?" And they'll say, "Yeah." I said, "Well, how would you feel if somebody took that animal and then made it into quote unquote food?" And they'd be like, "No way." And I said, "Have you ever thought about why we label some things part of the family or pets or companion animals or whatever, but other things we treat as products or food?" Because that conditioning starts when you're wicked, wicked little, when they start saying hot dog instead of dead pig, when they start saying halibut instead of dead fish. I said it starts at a really young age where they try to disassociate us from our natural inclination. Like if you put a carrot and an apple and a bunny in a crib with a baby, yeah, because babies experience the world through their mouth, so they might try to like put their mouth on the bunny's fur because it's soft, but they're not going to try and eat the animal. And I said to our electrician was over here the other day, and he's like, "I noticed that you guys are like vegan. Like, what's that all about?" And I said, and he was talking about whatever. I said, "When in the history of humanity has it?" I go, "Let me ask you this. How old are you?" And he's like 30 something. I go, "Have you ever driven past a cow and thought, I just need to crawl underneath that cow and suckle from that teat because this is the most natural thing to do?" I said, "It's not natural. It's no more natural than a cow nursing off of a human." I'm like, that was not made for us. In
Yeah,
fact,
the
many
breast
people don't
milk of
even
another
have.
species. Yeah, it's just so funny. I never realized it was just that obvious. At the very least, it's just weird, to be drinking the
Well,
breast milk of another
right.
species. Yeah. Yeah.
Think about, I'm not enlightening you on anything, Chrissy, but like think about how weird it is when you tell somebody, "Oh yeah, that egg you're eating, it's the end of an ovulation. It's a period. It's a
Right.
chicken period." They're like, "What?" They're like, "Don't ruin it for me." And this is where I know the psychology is at, because I've sat in rooms with people where they're going to boil these lobsters, which to me is one of the most horrific and cruel and brutal things that you can do, that you take a live being and you drop it in a pot of water. And you know what they do? They block their ears because they can't stand the sound of the animal. But then they'll unblock their ears when it's done and crack their bodies open and like gobble them up. And I just think, oh my God, there is such a disconnect. And I gotta say, there are days when I don't feel like playing nice. There are days when I will just make a post and I'll say, like, explain to me how you can be an animal lover, but you keep eating them. You keep paying somebody else. And somebody who's an influencer did a post the other day, and they were talking about how when they go out to eat, they pick the last bit. When they're talking about quote unquote meat in bone. Okay, but they're talking about this, and they were talking about how when they eat meat off a bone, they get every last scrap and morsel off it of it. And they were sharing a meal with somebody who didn't do it as impeccably as they did. And they were saying, I'm so offended by the fact that like they would leave all that meat on the bone. Like the way to eat it is X, Y, and Z. And then they said, show some respect to that animal that died for you. And I was like, want to talk about offended? I'm like, how about we stop fooling ourselves? I'm like, that animal didn't die for you. It died because of you. Like, let's start getting the facts straight. And I'm kind of over like the whole, like I've been to Kripalu. Kripalu is a big yoga center in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. It's where I did my yoga teacher training, and I lived there for a month. And when I was there, everything was either vegan or vegetarian. And then they caved to societal pressure and they started serving meat and stuff like that. And I'll never forget having to sit at a table because it's like silent breakfast, I'm sitting at this table and I'm watching this person. And it was like again and again and again. So you know how when we write, we pull pieces. You, as a novelist, you know this. I'm a memoirist, and I write true stuff, but there's a lot of truth in novels. I want to say that, but you know what I'm saying. You can kind of pull from a lot of different characters. So it's not just one person. I've watched this little ceremony again and again and again when people think they're being so spiritual by like putting their hands over their food and closing their eyes and praying. And I'm like, for this animal that sacrificed itself for me. I'm like, that animal did not sacrifice itself for you. It had no say in the matter. You didn't ask it, if it wanted that. So we fooled ourselves into our own human superiority, and it's all a racket. And I don't know if we're going to wake up fast enough before we completely destroy this planet. I don't have children. And I look at my friends who are birthing kids right now, and I just think I have no kind of idea what kind of world is going to be left for them, what kind of environment is going to be left for them, because we are not waking up fast enough. We are not willing to give up the things that make us comfortable, the things that we like. We can be an incredibly beautiful species, but we can be an incredibly stupid and ignorant species. And at this point, it is willful ignorance. Like at this point, there is just too much data pointing to how humans, through their consumption and consumption of animals, is ruining the planet. But people don't want to give up the things that they like to eat and consume. Whether that's like, people just, I'm going to stop there in case there's something you want to say. I could just go and go and go. So please.
And the ultimate irony, of course, I agree. Of course, I echo all your feelings and everything you've expressed. But the grand irony is that they don't want to give up these things that they never chose to start eating in the first place. They were forced to eat them. They were, taught to eat them. They were trained and conditioned into eating them. They never chose it. And now as adults, we get to choose. We get to think about, like you were saying, what our values are and how we want to live. And we don't have to shut down our critical thinking every time we sit down to a meal. And we don't have to shut down our innate compassion, So that's the grand irony, is people are clinging to these so-called foods that were forced on them as kids, and that are poisoning their bodies and, killing the planet. So yeah. So tell us more about your work, because it sounds like you've really, taken it upon yourself to just, like you said, plant seeds and awaken some consciousness and speak truth. How did that evolve?
Yeah. So before we go on to that, one final thing I want to say is that there was a yoga teacher that he's still very much alive and he is very healthy, and even in his advanced years, he's still doing like headstands and he's like a remarkable teacher. His name is Dharma Mitra. And Dharma, I used to study with him, and something that he said one time, because he proposes a vegan diet, he thinks we should be kind to the animals and leave the animals alone. I'll never forget one time that he said, when you choose to eat animals, your refrigerator becomes a morgue and your body becomes a graveyard. And it has never left me. Like, that imagery has like always, always stayed with me. And when I share that with people, you could see it. There's just there's certain ways that I can communicate that, in the work that I do as a spiritual mentor, as somebody who helps people, get out of their own way, try to end kind of their own suffering, is we have to do a lot of pattern interrupts. And so there's certain things that I know that I can say that will boom, like it's literally like boom, it puts on the brakes and it interrupts a pattern of thinking for people. And that's what I find most interesting and fascinating about the work that I do. Again, not telling people what to think, but inviting them into a conversation with their truest self and their truest values, and saying like, have you questioned any of this? Like, why do you do this? Like, why have we normalized so much violence and brutality and like cruelty and whatever? So again, I don't cram my belief systems down anybody's throats, but I do invite them to question things. And I think so many people, like you're saying, like as children, they were deeply conditioned. It was either Plato or Aristotle who said, "Give me the boy until he is 8, and I will show you the man." And so I kind of come in after the fact, working with adults, trying to now help them interrupt their own patterns. It's not because I'm
Mhm.
trying to fix anybody or whatever. People come to me because they say they want to transform. And
Mhm.
really, a lot of times I just think of my work in the world, first and foremost, my job is just to love people and to love animals. And partly how I do that is to help them not to suffer, and if I do that through education or giving people tools or whatever. So how I came into the work that I do is I was a yoga teacher. I've been a yoga teacher for like a really long time. And I found myself after class, because I had a brick and mortar studio for like 10 years. And I found after class, people would just naturally start to, like, I'm trying to sweep the floor, like empty the trash and do stuff. And people would just linger, they would linger and they would start asking me questions. And I say, they would talk to me about all the D's, like death, divorce, disappointment, the diagnosis, like, the whatever was going on, a decision they had to make, whatever.
Mhm.
And my sweetie would be at home, like on the rare nights that he would be home, because he's a professional musician, so he gigs at night, whatever. And he'd have make dinner or waiting for me. And I'm like now an hour behind because I was like trying to help these people. Because again, I'm wicked sensitive and I have a deep sense of empathy and sympathy. And if somebody's crying in front of me, it's kind of hard for me to just like go out and say, "Hey, I got dinner." You know what I mean? But one of my spiritual mentors once said to me, you know, this is an imbalanced relationship. Like, you can't keep giving and not getting something back. And I realized in some ways I was already doing spiritual mentoring, but I wasn't calling it that and I wasn't getting paid for it. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
she was a person who used to be, she was a yoga teacher, but she was also a former professor at UNH, and she was a psychologist, and she was like many things. And she's now actually a graduate of, I don't know if it's Harvard Divinity School, but one of the divinity schools, and she's
Mm.
brilliant. And so I trained under her for a year. So I'm a certified spiritual mentor, because anybody can hang a shingle these days saying they're a thing. So it was through that I became a spiritual mentor. And then I'm just a lifelong learner. Like, I'm wicked curious. Like, on my tombstone, if I had one, I want to be cremated. But if I did have a tombstone, probably the two words they would say is like love and curiosity. Like, and loves
Mm.
animals, try to love people. And I'm just really curious. So I have then gone on to I always just add to my skill set. And that's what's wicked funny is when you said send a short bio, like a short sentence of like who you are and what you do. And I was like, oh my God. It kicked off like this whole, like, I was like, how do I talk about, because I'll often say, "Oh, I'm a spiritual mentor, I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller, I'm a speaker, I'm a podcaster, I'm a yoga teacher, I'm a gateless writing instructor, I'm a hypnotist, I'm a this, I'm a that." So really, when you look at though the connective
The
thread to
common
all those
factor,
things
yeah,
are,
yeah.
yes, is to be to help. And I think that one of the things that I deeply, deeply realized as I got older is I really believe that the guy that murdered my mother, if he had had any sort of spiritual toolkit, if he had any way to pattern interrupt himself, if he had had any way to slow down his rage or to see my mother as a living human being with children and a life and blah blah, then she would still be alive. And so my work is very much inspired by, influenced by, you know, by her, and both her life in the short time I had with her for those 12 years, what she taught me, the way she advocated for people who didn't have power, the way that she loved animals, the way that she loved children, the way that she just loved people. She loved the outcast, and I'm totally like, Rocky is like my movie, like my movie for my lifetime is Rocky, that underdog story, that comeback kid kind of story. And I'm like, as long as I am drawing breath in my body, I'm going to speak up for people, and I'm going to speak up for animals, and I'm going to try to spread as much love as I can in the world. And I do it in a lot of different ways, using a lot of different tools, because I don't think that all people respond to all things the same way. So I want to be able to meet people as best as I can with a lot of different skill sets. So that's kind of how I ended up, doing what I do now. And I'm a writer and a storyteller. And so podcasting, I'm a communicator as well. Like I love to, as you can tell, no, you can tell, I love to talk and communicate with people. And I see, wait, who's that in the background? Who's that little pup in the background I see back there?
These are my little doggy guests. There's
Oh my God.
Chance and Dot. Yes, yes. They're just with me for a couple of days. They belong to a friend. Yes, they normally live with her,
Oh,
but
they're
it's been really fun
adorable.
having
Sorry.
them. Yes. Yes. I
Dog
have a lot
distraction
of
for
doggy
real,
guests. Yes.
yeah. It's so
um,
cute.
but so
So,
Karen, what's it been like working on this memoir? And when can people find it? When can people get it? But most of all, I'm just interested to hear what the process of writing it has been like for you.
yeah, this has been like literally like a life's work. I have been writing this thing for so long. And I just felt like, I don't know how to explain it other than it felt like uh, it's a memoir, right? So it's not like, oh, I was born. It's literally, it starts with like the inciting incident of like what happened and then how we got here. And it has been really, really hard. I'm not going to lie. There have been moments when it's been like, oh, yeah, like that felt really good to write that. But there's a lot of resistance that comes with writing. I don't know if you know who Stephen Pressfield is. He wrote the book, The
Mm.
War of Art, and
Oh,
a
I've read
lot of
that book.
he writes
Yes, yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
love Stephen's work, and there's a lot of resistance, and it's not easy stuff to write about. It to go back, and I write in the first person, and the kind of how do I explain this? The kind of writer that I am, what I literally do in my mind is I put myself back into that 12-year-old body, or I put myself back into that scene, and then I kind of look around, right? And I'm like, what am I feeling? What am I seeing? What am I hearing? I kind of write. It's not that I'm very like super descriptive in my writing, but I'm almost more like a movie maker with words. Like I think cinematically, right?
Mhm.
So I've had to go back and like feel. I let myself. So there have been many a day when I've been writing this book and I'm just sobbing, like just bawling at my desktop. And there have been days when I'm like, I can't, like even now, just bringing it up, it's choking me up. Um, there's some chapters that are really hard to write, but it's got to be done. I literally have a quote, my own quote, like looking at me right here. And it just says, I don't ever want to regret not writing it. So no matter how hard it is, like I'm just going to keep plugging along. And there have been times when I've taken a whole year away from writing, just honestly, it was just like,
Mhm.
it's a lot. and also being an entrepreneur, it's like you're trying to keep the roof over your head and run your business and write a book and like finding time for everything and where does this fit in. And you're multi-passionate. I mean, you're changing, as you know, like you're a writer, but you're also a lawyer, but you're also probably a therapist, and it
Yep.
sounds like you're also a lifelong learner, right? You
Yes.
do
No,
so
I
many
relate
incredible things.
100%. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm determined, though. I'm
Hmm.
determined, and so I'm just like one day at a time, one foot in front of another,
Hmm.
one word at a time. And so, like, you can
Yeah.
see back there that big calendar that's behind me. There's a all those yellows at the end of the month. Those are for, like, just like, not so much word count. I don't keep track of that, but like, did I write every day, or 5 days a week, or whatever.
Hmm.
And it has been like I've had to use self hypnosis on myself, and I continue to still, like, there's still days when like I say, the force is strong in this one. The resistance is
Hmm.
like strong,
Hmm.
but I'm not giving up. And my goal is to finish the first draft. I'm about 150 pages in. So I want to finish the first draft this year. My dream has always been to, traditionally publish. I know a lot of people who are very successful writers, and that's always been my dream. That's why I saw it. Like Stephen King, Stephen King saved me. Stephen King saved me as a 12-year-old. And
Hmm.
I actually have a chapter in my book about him, because
Hmm.
people can say whatever they want about his writing, but for those of us that he spoke to at a young age, and his stories, and he's so prolific, and I
Hmm.
have a little I have a deep love for Stephen King, and he like saved me. And his book on writing was just so fantastic. And I keep a little
Yeah,
picture
I
of my
loved it
mother, right?
too.
So this is
Yeah.
yeah, on writing.
Hmm.
Yeah, I keep this picture of my mother. This is my mother incarnate, right? My mother with an animal in her lap, always, right? So I keep this picture on my desk, and I look at it every day. And
What's her name?
and I her well, she was adopted, so her given name was Priscilla, and she hated it. So, and I mean, I think Scylla is
It's
really cute.
beautiful.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I have a stuffed bunny. You can't see her over there. I've had since I was like 14, 15, and I named her Scylla. But everybody called my mother Patty. And
Oh.
and my mother was radiant. I mean, my mother's gravitational pull, like when she walked into a room, like like you knew she was there. She loved people, she saw people. My stepfather once said to me a few years ago, we don't really have a relationship, but he got sick, and so I went to see him in the hospital. And he was reminiscing, and he told me a story, and he said to me, "Your mother was the most alive person I have ever met." And her spirit, and the detectives, I've talked to the detectives who did her case. They're most of them are dead now, but um, they said to me that everybody they talked to said that they loved your mother, that she had this life to her, like this light to her. So I've always carried that, and I think of this book as it took me a long time, because I always said this is a book about my mother. And then all my writing, my writing teacher said, no, this is a book about you, and your mother's a part of it. But I do think of this book as like a love letter to my mother, for her to not be forgotten. Because I think, when there's a murder, like, people just want to sweep it under the carpet. Like, they just don't want to think about it. It changed our community. It changed our lives. It changed all of our lives. It changed our community. The guy that killed her was a local guy. So there were these different camps of people who thought he was innocent and people who thought he wasn't. And it was a really intense time. But, her story deserves to be told. And I just see what happened to her as an extension to what happens to so many animals, that they don't get a say in whether they live or die. And I don't think that's right. So, my whole thing is that I think animals really, really deserve every kindness and compassion that we have to offer. I mean, what's the point of being human and having reasoning and having the ability to choose if we're not going to choose for love, and we're not going to choose for kindness and compassion and mercy? I just don't understand why we would want to waste our time just staying in the cog of like violence and brutality and destruction and whatever. So it's just not that interesting to me. So um, I struggle a little bit when I often say to people, I know that I don't live in a vegan world. And some days it's not easy. Some days it's not easy. And I have a lot of friends who say they're animal lovers, but they choose to keep doing things. And sometimes you have to reconcile that. But you know what? It's like my best friend KT. We met over the internet in when we were taking our hypnosis training, one of our hypnosis trainings, and she lived in Utah. And she became my best friend. We've only met once in person. We've been best friends for like 3 years now. We've only met once in person. And it was just through me being me that a year ago, almost, like maybe it's been 12, 14 months now, but a year ago, she made the decision to go vegan. And this has happened to me many, many times where me being me, kind of like Bobby Rock, he passed the baton to me by just being himself, and slowly but surely. And then she watched one of the vegan documentaries, and she said, she goes, a lot of her, I think she'd be fine with me sharing this because she's spoken about it publicly, is that she was so mad at herself for her willful ignorance and how long she did it. She's a total animal lover. And she said, um, I could never go back. I could never go back now that I know what I know. And I let it sink in. Like, I really let myself feel it. And I let myself feel my own horror at myself for choosing to stay willfully ignorant. And some things you just don't know, right? Some things you just don't know, but we know enough. And I think all of us at this point know enough. And so those of us, who have the microphones or who have opportunities and can be a voice for the animals, we got to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for everything that you're doing for animals and for the cause. And what I appreciate so much about your story, I mean, among the many things I could name, but it's that, you obviously suffered a really tragic experience. And instead of, just falling into a lifetime of self victimization and victimhood, you've taken it upon yourself to prevent others from being victims, namely and most especially the animals. And that's beautiful. And I just admire that choice so much, because I feel like sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes people who are victims themselves and survive, they fall into the role of being oppressors. They fall into the role of making sure that they themselves have their rights and their lives and their autonomy and their safety and security, but they want to keep it close to themselves. They don't want to share it. And so the fact that you turned it and you opened yourself up instead of just, withdrawing into yourself and falling into self-pity and just lack of power, you transformed that pain into compassion and power. And yeah, I just appreciate
So
everything so much. And like
oh,
you,
you're
I
making
mean,
me
yeah,
cry.
it's not, I feel you. Obviously, I mean, part of the reason I started this podcast is that it's not easy as a vegan walking around in this parallel universe. How I feel like, where even the people who claim to love animals just ignore this parallel universe of suffering. And yet at the same time, and I suspect you feel this way too. I'm so grateful to, for whatever reason, have had the willingness to ask some questions, to dig a little deeper, and to have found what I really do believe is the best way to live. I mean, I'm so grateful. Yes, it's hard, but more than anything, I feel lucky. I feel so lucky. And when you think about it, the people at the forefront of any social justice cause have been the outliers in their time. It's just part of it's part of the package when, for whatever. And again, I don't think there's anything particularly noble about not participating in our sociopathic animal-based food system. I think it's a pretty low moral baseline to not hurt animals if we don't have to. So it's not even like I'm particularly proud of being vegan. Again, I think it's a pretty low moral baseline, but yeah, more than anything, I'm just so grateful. And I'm grateful, also just that it connects me with people like you and other people who've, had a similar path and come to the same conclusion. And it makes me feel connected in a way that I never did before going vegan. So yeah, so I'm so grateful to connect. And again, thank you so much. We'll certainly include all your information about your coaching and your spiritual mentorship in the show notes, and encourage people to reach out to you for guidance and mentorship and inspiration. And please keep us posted on your memoir. Congratulations too. I mean,
Thank you.
as a writer, I definitely know the war of art and the resistance, and again,
Mhm.
this huge paradox that the thing that we're most called to do is also the thing that brings up the most resistance. What is that about? What is that about?
You know,
Um,
it's so great. Stephen Pressfield talks about it like resistance. When you have really big resistance, like, get excited because it means there's a really big dream. It means that
mm,
because the dream comes first, the resistance is a shadow, and it's
mm,
trying to block out the dream that you're really, really passionate about. And I just have to say, like, how grateful I am for you and for people like you. But first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I never, ever, ever take it for granted when another person invites me to have a conversation and maybe get to speak to their community. Although I think we, kind of share a community as vegans.
yeah.
But for you to take the time to invite me is really beautiful. And everything you just said was so lovely. And um, I'm getting better these days at really letting stuff land. And so,
Mm,
like, your words were very kind, and I appreciate that. And I agree with you that, I mean, like, yeah, it's so funny when you talk to vegans because it's very rare. I'm always just like, check, yes, agree, yes, agree, yes, agree.
hmm.
And I love that I got to know you. And I know I almost wish we had another whole hour. So now I could ask you all the questions I have about you. I love that you have a book. I'm gonna get it immediately. I can't
Yay.
wait to read it. I know that you're on a transition. Have you talked about it on the show? I don't want to, like, I mean, that your own work and how you're
A
kind of
little bit. I
transitioning a
don't
little
talk
bit.
about myself too much, but yes, I'm in grad school to become a clinical mental health counselor. So yes, I'm currently in the
Which I
midst
just
of my
love.
internship, and yes, and I trained in a type of therapy called internal family systems, or IFS therapy,
Which is
years
okay. Hold
ago.
on.
So I've been on this
Yeah,
path for a long time. Oh, what have you got?
yeah. Well, I'm a huge fan of Dick Schwartz, but
Oh,
so I'm
yes.
laughing because my IFS, IFS,
Oh,
one of
I
my, I
love
have a
it.
whole
I love
bookshelf of
it.
IFS books. One of the things I talk about, my clients with is, I always say, I tried to train with him, but because he opened up, or he was starting to let, not we didn't have to be a licensed mental health counselor. He was
Yes, and that's
allowing
when I
coaches and
trained.
stuff to
Yeah.
train.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I put my name in
I'll
for the lottery like a
I
bunch
didn't
of
train with
times,
him
and
personally. Yeah, I didn't train with him personally, but I did an
yeah.
official IFS training. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but so it wasn't just like, but I put my name into the lottery like 4 times and
Uh-huh.
it never got picked, and then
Oh.
they kinda changed it again where they're like, now it's back to, like, trained mental health counselors and stuff like that.
Oh,
But
wow.
I've been a huge IFS fan for a really long time, and I talk about, I think it's so fun that you brought this up because I think it's one of the
Well,
things I
he's
read
from
about you, that you
Boston.
loved IFS.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
he's
I
from
know,
Boston,
I
and that's where
know.
I first heard about IFS. Was when I was living in Boston. I had a friend who was a therapist, and I was thinking about going to grad school back then, and she said, "Oh, no, 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 don't even bother, because I've discovered this new kind of therapy that's more effective than anything else I've seen, and you don't have to be a licensed therapist. You can do a training and become a practitioner." And so that's what I did. That's what I did. I was the only non
Oh my
therapist in my
god.
group, but I trained with everybody and we practiced, and they were
Oh my
wonderful.
god.
And everybody would say to me, "I can't believe you're not a therapist." And so yeah, I've been practicing it for a long time, but it makes sense, the Boston connection, because that's where Dick Schwartz is from, and that's where I first encountered it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. When I left California in 1998 and moved back east, my therapist at the time, who was brilliant, her name is Daphne Rose Kingma. She's written many, many books. She's a relationship expert. She's in Santa Barbara, California. And I met through her through Marianne Williamson. That's a whole story for another day. But Daphne became like, I tend to have these women in my life, like Marianne became like a spiritual mother to me, and Daphne
Mm,
became like a spiritual mother to me. These women who kind of like took me under their wings, you know. But I wanted to be a therapist. So when I first came back here, she wrote me this beautiful recommendation letter to go to Goddard College because I thought I wanted to be a therapist. And then I realized I didn't want to go back to school and have to write all
yeah.
these papers and do it.
Yeah.
I'm like, so I became a yoga teacher and I
Uh-huh.
started helping.
Uh-huh.
But even now, like I always say to my clients, hashtag not a therapist, but I do total therapeutic work. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So it's
Yeah.
really interesting. So I love that. I love that you are going to be out there helping people. I love that. I think vegans, like you have the heart of a vegan, which already tells me that you're a deeply compassionate and empathetic person. So I love that people are going to get to heal with you and work with you and transform and learn to think differently. And it's not like you're bringing your, it's so interesting, right? It's not like you're bringing your veganism into your sessions, but you are in a way. It's like it's in there, you know, it can't not be in there that this is how you move through the world. So I think it's beautiful. And I'm so happy that we got to meet. And thank you so much for doing what you do and having the show that you have and spreading the love the way that you do. It's a really lovely and powerful and important thing. And I know you're going to keep going, but like keep going. And
Aw, thank
I think you should
you.
reach out to Jordan, my friend Jordan, and have him on the show
I
because
would love
he's pretty
that. Yes.
remarkable as well.
Yeah, I would love that.
I'll
I
make the
would love
connection.
that.
I'll pass it. I'll make the connection. Yeah. Right
Perfect.
on. Thank you
Perfect. Well,
so much.
again, I could keep chatting for hours, but we have a lifetime. We have a lifetime. And we
I
close
know.
every episode by taking 30 seconds of silence for all of the
Mm,
suffering animals, human and non-human, who desire, as we all do, safety, happiness, and the freedom to live out their lives
mm.
without interference. So, Karen, I invite you to join me in 30 seconds of silence for the animals, and we'll conclude with the sound of the bell. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Posse. See you next time. Until then, stay strong and stay true.
Bye.